That's Nick.
And that's Joseph. And today we're here to talk about episode 2 of Mary and George, which will be available to stream on Starz as of April 5th, 2024.
This episode was a doozy.
Also directed by Oliver Hermanus.
So it starts in the year 1615. So we know from the last episode, Mary got George in front of the king, and he made quite the impression because George got into a fight and the king had to kind of break it up. So in this episode, we see that Mary's trying to figure out how she can get George in front of the king again. So she goes to one of the king's confidants, Sir David.
Sir David Graham, the only English member of his
Entourage,
yeah.
And he's like, Sir David says, well, the king is traveling from A to B, so maybe we can have George intercept him on the road. And I'll give you a location, no one else will be there, and George can try to make an impression. So we see George goes, and there are like dozens of other gay men.
Nubile young men.
Who someone refers to as Peacock Pete's. They're all standing on the side of the road trying to get a piece of the king.
And this older homosexual is kind of goading George.
Which was funny.
And he asks him if he is a hammer or anvil.
But anyway, George tries to make an impression, but basically falls face first into the mud. So Mary goes back to Sir David, like, okay, well, what's the plan? Well, I don't know. What do you suggest? Well, I think you need to let me go talk to the queen, the king's wife.
Queen Anne, played by Trina Dearholm.
And we can get more into it, but Mary does get to go talk to the queen and basically says, I think my son should replace Somerset, the Earl.
The Earl of Somerset, yeah.
Who apparently the queen can't stand.
Is unruly.
And the queen asks Mary, well, can you keep your son under control? And Mary says, yes, of course.
She says he's subject to my rule.
So the queen has George basically dance for the king in like an ensemble.
Very Salome, yeah.
And we can see that the king notices George, maybe even recognizes him from previously. And the queen brings George to the king and says, you should knight him so he can be a part of your entourage.
I think she says very directly, I think you need a new bedfellow or something of that nature.
So just to make this summary quick, we see that George gets in there and literally has sex with the king. So then what's going on with Mary? We know from the first episode, Mary lied about her lineage. She doesn't have this noble background. She was just a regular old servant. But she had her husband, who was of some lineage, falsify her papers. So when Mary went to Sir David and Sir David went to the queen, it would appear that the queen had Sir David do some recon on Mary to make sure she was legit. And so they went to Mary's barrister, who we met in episode 1, who basically told her, like, you're broke, you need to find a new husband, and don't worry, your secret's safe with me. But they go and rough his ass up.
They torture him.
But we also know from episode 1, he had burned, or Mary had burned, the proof of how she paid for her name. So they go rough his ass up and get him to write out the truth and sign it. So she finds out through Sir David that he knows the truth. And also the barrister told her what happened.
Yep, so she already knows that, and she's prepared because the night that George is canoodling with the king, she goes to this brothel madam played by Niamh Algar, Sandie, who she met. She was meeting Sir David Graham in the brothel for their insidious business, and she goes back because she's attracted to Niamh.
And we can get more into that, but Julianne has spent the night with this brothel madam, and the brothel madam recognizes there's someone following her. So these two ladies have the bright idea to disarm Sir David and his thug by poisoning them and killing them.
With prunes.
So we think.
Never eat the prunes at a brothel, we're told. It reminded me of Raiders of the Lost Ark with the bad dates.
So we think Mary's in the clear because she has killed these two men, but Sir David's dead, it would seem, but the thug is not. He wakes up and he gets that signed paperwork and cuts off Sir David's ring,
His finger with the ring on it.
like the ring that would denote that it's him. And we see this thug take it to some person we don't know.
A man of unknown origin.
So as the episode ends, we see that George is in with the king, literally, but that Mary's secret is not safe.
And I think we're also sidestepping. The title of this episode is The Hunt.
Yes, I didn't mention that.
Uh-huh.
So when Mary goes to the brothel to meet Sir David to talk about her son's future, that brothel madam immediately says, I see you. Like, I can see that you're a lesbian.
Oh, yeah.
That happened very quickly.
Like they're smelling each other.
I thought, so I guess I was a little, this episode felt a little, based on episode 1, I assumed that this would be a little more,
High art?
maybe, and a little more intricate and complex. But then episode 2, it's just boom, boom, pow.
Oh, this is not The Crown. This is...
No, this feels more like, I mean, this could be like a Ryan Murphy production. Like, which I don't mind. I mean, I like salacious shit, but this was a little too, specifically with the Queen, which we can get to in a second. But I did enjoy when George is by the side of the road and we see all these other clearly like gay men just wanting a piece of the king. That was pretty bold. Because have you ever seen that in like a story?
I mean, we live in Hollywood, so we see...
I'm talking about on film. Like,
sure.
you don't see that. So it was pretty remarkable. So we didn't mention, or I didn't, that Mary still has this older son to deal with. John. And this episode, it's made very clear that John is like lame. But she's trying to marry his ass off. And she writes to some woman who we find out was maybe putting the word out that her daughter, who is also maybe a little simple, needs a husband who is, they use the word like sweet and quiet or, you know, implying that maybe someone who's also a little simple. Man, that lady comes over with her people and her daughter and they sit down for dinner and that lady drags the hell out of Julianne and her family.
Yeah.
And basically says, I see right through you. I know what you're up to. The fact that you even think that your old crazy ass son is good enough for my daughter, and I know that you ain't shit, and your gay ass son, you're trying to admit
your other bun burying son, yeah.
Like, it took my breath away. That was a very good scene. Okay, the Queen. So Mary goes to Sir David and says, I want to meet the Queen, and he's like, and then we literally cut to Mary meeting the Queen.
Trina, which is a lovely union between two great actors, Trina Dearholm and Julianne Moore.
Certainly. But the Queen kind of, like, Sir David makes it kind of discreet. He goes up to the Queen and says, remember that, like, unscheduled appointment I wanted to make for you? Well, I think you need to come see about that.
And Queen Anne is just like, do.
And she just walks over to, like, this canopy, and you see Julianne in the shadows. And then they just talk very bluntly and concisely about like, oh, so you think your son will be good enough for my husband, and this is your lineage. I haven't heard of you. Are you sure you're legit?
Are you a pureblood?
Yeah, she says, are you a pure or of good blood or whatever? And then they just make the deal. I think I needed more than that. I think I needed to understand what about Somerset. I mean, it's obvious on a very esoteric level.
Well, he's Scottish, and we're in England, so there's that kind of conflict going on between the cultures. And also, it seems like Somerset has grown beyond his means. It seems like he's uncontrollable.
Right.
Okay.
So
we again.
Right.
We're assuming that we don't see it.
But I think that's a fair assumption. But I just feel like for what was the conversation between Sir David and the Queen? Like, how did he even approach her with this? And then, because I understand, like, we don't know that Sir David is gay. So maybe he's more aligned with the Queen, and he also doesn't like I mean, we know he doesn't like Somerset. But I would have loved that conversation. And then, like, I don't know, for the Queen to just meet Mary and for her to just so directly tell her what she wants. I would have loved that conversation, the conversation that happened leading up to that meeting.
Sure.
So it all felt very jarring.
You wanted a little more finesse.
Yeah, a little foreplay, something.
Yeah,
I don't know.
this is a railroad train into the king's bed this episode.
Literally. Okay, so again, when the queen literally takes George by the hand and like takes him to the king, but then we're told that they had to be strategic because they had to sort of set it up so the king leaves Somerset. So they say like, oh, the king is going to go attend to some person who got hurt.
His sickly son.
His son, not a person. And so Somerset, and they say, well, Somerset's not interested in that, so he won't follow him. And then the queen just says, knight him. He can be part of your entourage.
Yeah.
I need a little bit more. Like, I want to understand their dynamic. I'm assuming maybe in the upcoming episodes, we might get flashbacks to how these two developed this dynamic, like how the queen was okay with this gay-ass husband of hers.
Well, she had no choice.
Sure, but
this is their only shot at having comfort and some semblance of power.
Which makes total sense to me, but I just think like it would be so cool to see it play out, like a flashback to the first time she knew that she married this butt boy.
These open secrets that everyone knows.
Yeah, that just would have been really interesting. Okay, so now that George is part of the entourage, we see that Somerset is not feeling him. And it all culminates in a hunting trip, the hunt. And Somerset, I mean, there's some foreshadowing because Somerset says like, another one of the king's little boys got killed mysteriously. So basically, Somerset's threatening George. And then he surmises that George is not a good hunter. And then George's dumbass decides to go hunting. But then George is smart because
Well, the king also warns him.
Okay, that's another note of mine. If the king thinks Somerset is out of control, and if the king craves new boys, why wouldn't you get his ass out of here?
Well, he's still the main squeeze. He hasn't reached his sell-by date yet. So, but it's like everybody can probably see it on the horizon, including Somerset.
If I had my pick of the litter and full control, you're not going to just run my shit. Like, I just don't understand.
Because you haven't seen The Favourite, with the Yorgos Lanthimos film, which Olivia Colman won her Oscar for, who's kind of playing these games with the women she's sleeping with as well.
That's why I'm saying I think that as someone who doesn't know much about the history of this historical figure and not much about this world, I don't know that in episode 2 I felt like oriented in why the king is tolerating Somerset's nonsense, knowing that it upsets his queen, knowing that it's blocking him from other boys. If he's so boy crazy, why would you want someone there who's like blocking new boys from you to have?
I'm assuming he's the kind of guy that likes people, based on his warning to George, it's like, oh, you like people to fight, to vie for you.
I think you're right. I just wish the series would have given me a little bit more. But George has the plan during the hunt to hurt himself so that the king will tend to him and feel sorry for him. So George falls off the horse, but makes it seem like, or it looks like Somerset pushed him off. But then we see George run into a tree to injure himself. And then, of course, his king in shining armor comes to rescue him, and the king tends to him. We even have the doctor or whomever is tending to George's wounds tell him that whatever treatment I'm using on you is super expensive, and we normally use it very sparingly. But the king said, spare no expense.
And George is very demure because the king asks him, did Somerset do this to you? He's like, oh no, it was just poor riding. And
the king is very impressed by that. He's like, well, most people would throw him under the bus, but the fact that you shows a lot of class and dignity. So he seems to like that. He also likes that George can speak French.
He's playing this king like a harp from hell.
And then while George is recuperating in like, I guess the equivalent of a hospital, the king comes in there and basically tells him like, I want you to bend me over and knock it out. And that's what happens.
You're going to be the hammer. I'm going to be the anvil.
I mean, wow. This was, Go ahead.
Yeah, it was. There were events happening.
There were events happening. Yeah. What else would you like to say about this episode?
That's it. I'm curious to see where it's going because we have, as I said, have zoomed very quickly into post-coitus.
Yeah. All right. Well, join us on Patreon and listen to our podcast. Bye.